Sometimes the biggest mistake is laughing before you know who is standing in front of you. The Marine Corps training gym echoed with the familiar sounds of another ordinary morning. Running shoes brushed across polished floors, heavy bags swayed gently after the last drill, and instructors called out short corrections that blended naturally with the steady hum of the ventilation system overhead. Bright white lights reflected across the center mat, while sunlight slipped through the high windows, painting long golden stripes across the room. For the young Marines gathered inside, it felt like any other day of training. None of them realized they were only minutes away from witnessing a lesson that would remain with them for the rest of their careers. Thomas Walker stepped quietly through the open entrance carrying a faded olive field jacket folded neatly over one arm and a worn canvas duffel bag that looked almost as old as the man himself. At 79 years old, his neatly trimmed gray hair and weathered face gave him the appearance of a quiet retiree, simply stopping by to watch the next generation train. His blue eyes moved calmly across the room, taking in every detail without drawing attention to himself. He did not interrupt anyone. He did not introduce himself. He simply found an empty space beside the wall and watched. Corporal Mason Reed noticed the visitor almost immediately. 24 years old, athletic, disciplined, and respected among his fellow Marines, Mason had built a reputation for excellence during every training exercise. He enjoyed competition because competition had always pushed him forward. When one of the younger Marines jokingly suggested inviting the elderly visitor onto the mat for a friendly demonstration, laughter spread through the room faster than anyone expected. "Come on, sir," Mason called with an easy grin. "Give us one round. We promise not to wear you out." More laughter followed. Several Marines reached for their phones, expecting nothing more than a light-hearted memory to share later. Even Staff Sergeant Liam Carter watched from nearby with relaxed curiosity. From where he stood, it looked like harmless fun between an energetic young Marine and an older visitor who would probably smile politely and decline. Thomas looked around the room before meeting Mason's eyes. There was no irritation in his expression, only quiet patience. He had seen youthful confidence before. He remembered wearing it himself many decades earlier. A gentle smile crossed his face. "If everyone is comfortable with that," he answered softly, "then I will be happy to join you." The laughter slowly faded. No one had expected him to accept so easily. Mason smiled even wider, believing the older man was simply playing along. "We will keep it friendly," he assured him. Thomas nodded once. That is usually the best place to begin. He walked toward the center mat with an unhurried stride that somehow felt deliberate without appearing dramatic. Reaching the edge, he carefully placed his weathered canvas bag beside a wooden bench, removed the cracked leather watch from his wrist, and folded his jacket into a perfect square before setting it neatly on top. Every movement was simple, precise, and practiced. Staff Sergeant Carter noticed the routine immediately. It was not nervous preparation. It looked like habit formed through countless repetitions over many years. Mason stepped onto the mat opposite him and settled naturally into a balanced stance. Around them, the Marines formed a wide circle. One by one, conversations faded until only the soft hum of the building remained. Phones slowly lowered. Smiles became uncertain. Without anyone realizing exactly when it happened, the atmosphere had changed. Thomas lifted his eyes and met the young Marine's confident gaze with the calm expression of a teacher patiently waiting for the first question. Neither man had moved yet, but everyone watching somehow felt the real lesson had already begun. The wide circle surrounding the training mat grew quieter with every passing second. The laughter that had filled the Marine Corps gym only moments earlier faded into an uneasy silence as dozens of young Marines found themselves studying the elderly visitor with growing curiosity instead of amusement. Bright overhead lights reflected across the polished floor while the soft hum of the ventilation system became strangely noticeable. Outside the open bay doors, distant cadence calls echoed across the base. But inside the gym, every pair of eyes remained fixed on the two men standing at the center of the room. Corporal Mason Reed adjusted his footing with practiced precision. Years of disciplined training had taught him confidence, balance, and composure under pressure. He respected veterans, but standing across from a 79-year-old man, he believed this would be nothing more than a friendly demonstration before everyone returned to the regular training schedule. He smiled politely. Whenever you are ready, sir. Thomas Walker answered with the same calm expression that had never left his face. No, he replied gently. Whenever you are ready. The response carried no challenge and no pride. It sounded more like quiet encouragement than competition. Several Marines exchanged puzzled glances. Staff Sergeant Liam Carter folded his arms while continuing to observe from only a few feet away. Something about the older man's posture refused to fit the picture everyone had formed when he first walked through the door. Thomas stood comfortably with relaxed shoulders and steady breathing. There was no visible tension in his hands, no nervous shifting of his feet, and no attempt to appear impressive. It was the posture of someone completely familiar with the environment around him. Mason chuckled softly, hoping to keep the atmosphere light. We are only having a little fun today. Thomas nodded. Some of the best lessons begin that way. The sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. It sounded practiced, almost timeless, as though it had been spoken to countless young Marines over many decades. Lance Corporal Eric Sullivan, standing near the back of the group, quietly lowered the phone he had planned to use for recording. Without understanding why, he no longer felt comfortable treating the moment like entertainment. Thomas slowly lifted his eyes toward Mason. Instead of staring directly at his face, his attention moved almost imperceptibly across the young Marine's shoulders, hips, knees, and boots before returning to his eyes. Staff Sergeant Carter noticed the subtle observation immediately. It reminded him of experienced instructors evaluating students during advanced certification courses rather than an ordinary visitor accepting a friendly invitation. Mason shifted one foot forward by only a few inches. Thomas noticed the adjustment without moving his head. Carter felt a quiet sense of curiosity building inside him. The older man seemed less interested in what Mason was doing than in why he was doing it. Around the edge of the mat, the Marines instinctively stepped back another pace, widening the circle without being instructed. Phones disappeared into pockets. Smiles became thoughtful expressions. The atmosphere no longer resembled a group waiting for entertainment. It felt remarkably similar to the opening moments of a serious lesson. Mason drew one slow breath and settled naturally into a balanced stance. Thomas answered with nothing more than a faint approving nod. Good, he said quietly. You are paying attention to your breathing. Mason blinked in surprise. He had not mentioned it, and no visible sign suggested anyone should have noticed. How did you know? He asked. Thomas smiled warmly. Your breathing changed before your posture did. The answer left the young Marine momentarily speechless. Around them, the gym became completely still. Every Marine present sensed that something far more important than a simple demonstration was about to unfold, even though not one of them yet understood who the quiet elderly man standing before them truly was. For several long seconds, neither man moved. The silence resting over the training mat became heavier than anyone expected, replacing every trace of laughter that had echoed through the gym only moments before. Corporal Mason Reed remained balanced and composed, years of disciplined Marine Corps training visible in every detail of his posture. His breathing stayed controlled, his shoulders relaxed, and his eyes remained fixed on the elderly veteran standing quietly across from him. Mason had spent countless hours developing confidence through repetition, and he trusted the fundamentals that had carried him through every challenge he had faced. Thomas Walker, however, looked as though he belonged to an entirely different rhythm. His hands rested comfortably at his sides, his shoulders remained loose, and the calm expression on his weathered face never changed. There was no visible tension, no attempt to appear impressive. He simply stood there with the quiet patience of someone who had spent a lifetime watching people learn. Staff Sergeant Liam Carter narrowed his eyes. Something about the older man's presence continued to trouble him in a way he could not explain. Every experienced instructor he had ever known displayed subtle signs before movement. They prepared mentally, adjusted posture, or focused intensely. Thomas displayed none of those habits. Instead, he seemed completely at ease, as though the polished training mat beneath his boots was as familiar as the floor inside his own home. Mason smiled politely, hoping to ease the growing tension. You seem very comfortable standing here, sir. Thomas answered with a warm smile of his own. Some places become familiar after enough years. The reply sounded simple, yet it carried a quiet weight that lingered inside the room. Lance Corporal Eric Sullivan found himself studying the older man's face instead of waiting for the demonstration to begin. Something about Thomas reminded him of faded photographs displayed during a leadership seminar at Quantico months earlier. He could not remember why, only that the same calm expression had appeared in those old images of Marine instructors standing beside young recruits. Mason slowly shifted one foot forward, preparing to close the distance. Before he completed the adjustment, Thomas spoke gently. "Your left shoulder rises first." Mason instinctively looked down before realizing he had unconsciously tightened one side of his body. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You noticed that?" Thomas nodded. The body usually tells the truth before the mind finishes making a decision. Several Marines quietly exchanged uncertain glances. Staff Sergeant Carter felt another wave of curiosity. The observation had been made without criticism, without hesitation, and without effort. It sounded less like a clever guess and more like the natural habit of someone who had spent decades studying movement. Mason inhaled once more, determined to be even more careful. This time he advanced with measured precision, allowing every step to remain controlled. Thomas responded with only the slightest adjustment of his own footing. The movement was almost invisible, yet somehow it changed the entire angle between them. Mason immediately realized he would have needed to alter his own position to continue comfortably. He stopped naturally instead of forcing the moment. No one spoke. The exchange had lasted only seconds, yet the atmosphere inside the gym had transformed completely. There had been no contest of strength, no dramatic display, and no sudden excitement. Instead, everyone had witnessed something far more unusual. Experience had quietly redirected confidence without raising its voice. Staff Sergeant Carter slowly unfolded his arms. His attention drifted toward the worn canvas bag resting beside the wooden bench. The older man had carried himself with remarkable precision from the instant he entered the building. Every movement reflected disciplined habit rather than age. Carter could not explain why, but a growing feeling told him they were standing in front of someone whose story stretched much farther than anyone inside the gym had imagined. Around the edge of the mat, every Marine remained silent. They were no longer waiting to see whether the elderly visitor could surprise them. They had begun wondering who had taught him to see so much by watching so little. Corporal Mason Reed drew one slow breath before finally committing to the first movement. His posture remained disciplined, balanced, and respectful, exactly as every Marine instructor expected during a controlled training exercise. The Marines surrounding the mat leaned forward almost in unison, eager to witness the friendly demonstration that had unexpectedly become the center of everyone's attention. Bright overhead lights reflected across the polished floor while the distant sound of cadence calls drifted faintly through the open bay doors. Thomas Walker never changed his expression. His calm, blue eyes remained fixed not on Mason's hands, but on the subtle rhythm of his breathing and the quiet shift of weight beneath his boots. Years of experience had taught Thomas that intention always appeared before movement if someone knew where to look. Mason stepped forward with smooth, practiced precision. Thomas responded with almost nothing at all. He rotated one foot slightly, allowing his shoulders to settle naturally while changing the angle between them by only a few inches. The adjustment appeared so small that several Marines questioned whether they had actually seen it happen. Mason immediately slowed and instinctively corrected his own position before continuing. He paused, then smiled with genuine curiosity. "You made me change my footing without saying a word." Thomas answered with a gentle smile. "You changed it yourself. I only gave you something new to notice." The reply left the room even quieter. Mason nodded respectfully. Again, Thomas inclined his head. "As many times as you need." The second exchange began even more carefully. Mason focused on every detail of his stance, determined to remove every unnecessary movement. Thomas remained relaxed until the final instant, then shifted his balance with effortless precision. Once again, Mason found himself adjusting rather than advancing exactly as he had intended. There was no contest of strength, no dramatic display, only quiet mastery rooted in observation and timing. Staff Sergeant Liam Carter slowly lowered his folded arms. The older man's movements reminded him of advanced instructor evaluations he had witnessed years earlier, where experienced trainers corrected students through positioning rather than force. Thomas seemed to recognize each decision before it fully developed, as though decades of teaching had sharpened his ability to read people instead of merely watching them. Around the edge of the mat, every Marine remained completely silent. The atmosphere no longer resembled a casual gathering. It felt unmistakably like a classroom led by someone whose authority required no introduction. Lance Corporal Eric Sullivan quietly stepped toward the wooden bench where Thomas had placed his belongings. Hoping to keep the folded jacket from slipping onto the floor, he gently lifted one corner. A small laminated card slid from an inside pocket and landed softly on the bench with a muted tap. Eric instinctively picked it up before it could fall. The plastic had yellowed with age, and the corners were rounded from decades of careful handling. A younger photograph of Thomas appeared beside faded official lettering that had become difficult to read. Eric tilted the card beneath the bright lights. The words Instructor Development Course slowly became visible across the top, followed by a location that immediately caught his attention. Quantico, Virginia. The issue date reached back more than 50 years. His expression changed from curiosity to surprise. Staff Sergeant Carter noticed the card in Eric's hands and quietly stepped closer. The moment his eyes reached the faded heading, something deep inside his memory stirred. Quantico instructor credentials from that era were exceptionally uncommon, and the name Thomas Walker sounded strangely familiar, though he could not yet explain why. Carter carefully accepted the card and looked from the photograph to the elderly veteran still standing calmly on the mat. For the first time since the morning began, he stopped seeing an ordinary visitor. Instead, he found himself wondering whether the quiet man before them had once stood in front of generations of young Marines long before anyone inside the gym had ever earned the uniform they proudly wore today. The faded instructor identification card rested quietly in Staff Sergeant Liam Carter's hands, yet it somehow seemed heavier than anything else inside the Marine Corps gym. The yellowed plastic sleeve reflected the bright overhead lights, while the worn edges suggested decades of careful handling rather than neglect. Carter studied the younger photograph of Thomas Walker before lifting his eyes toward the elderly veteran standing calmly at the center of the training mat. Time had added gray hair and deep lines to the man's face, but the steady eyes were unmistakably the same. Around them, every Marine remained silent. Corporal Mason Reed lowered his hands. Completely, no longer thinking about friendly competition. He had begun wondering who this quiet visitor truly was. Carter looked back at the faded lettering once more. Instructor Development Course. Quantico, Virginia. Beneath the title, another line slowly became visible as he tilted the card toward the light. Certified Instructor. The issue date reached back more than 50 years. Something stirred inside his memory. During one advanced leadership course years earlier, an instructor had briefly mentioned several early developers whose teaching methods helped shape modern Marine instruction. Carter could not remember every name, but Thomas Walker sounded remarkably familiar. He looked toward the elderly veteran. Thomas noticed the expression and smiled gently. "It has been a long time," he said. Carter nodded. "Long enough that history starts becoming difficult to recognize." Thomas answered quietly. "History usually belongs to the people who keep teaching it." The sentence lingered in the air. Lance Corporal Eric Sullivan glanced toward Mason, who now stood listening with complete attention. The confident grin that had started the morning had disappeared entirely. In its place was genuine curiosity. Carter reached into his pocket and removed his phone. Without another word, he opened the Marine Corps directory and searched for the Instructor Heritage Office at Quantico. Several Marines exchanged uncertain looks, but nobody interrupted him. Somehow, everyone understood that the moment had moved beyond an ordinary visit. Carter placed the call. The phone rang softly while the gym remained almost perfectly still. Thomas folded his hands comfortably in front of him, showing neither concern nor anticipation. Mason finally spoke. "Sir, did you really teach Marines?" Thomas looked toward the young corporal with the same patient expression he had carried since entering the building. "Every Marine teaches someone eventually," he replied. "The question is whether the lesson lasts." Mason considered the answer carefully. Before he could respond, Carter heard the call connect. He introduced himself, explained where he was calling from, and slowly read the information printed on the faded identification card. Silence followed on the other end. The pause lasted several long seconds before a calm voice finally replied. "Please repeat the name." Carter looked down once more. Thomas Walker. Another pause followed, noticeably longer than the first. Then the voice became more deliberate. Staff Sergeant, are you standing with him right now? Yes, Carter answered. Papers shuffled faintly through the speaker before the voice returned again. Please remain where you are while I verify the archived instructor records. Carter thanked the official and waited. The quiet hum of the ventilation system seemed louder than ever. Mason looked toward Thomas with entirely different eyes. The elderly veteran remained completely at ease, almost as though he had expected none of this to matter. After another minute, the voice returned. The records confirm his instructor credentials. Thomas Walker served among the early instructor development specialists at Quantico. His teaching methods influenced generations of Marine instructors through later training programs. Carter slowly lowered the phone. Around the room, nobody spoke. Mason felt the realization settle over him with surprising weight. The quiet man he had invited onto the mat for harmless entertainment had never needed to prove anything. Long before any of them had first worn the uniform, he had already helped shape the way Marines learned to observe, to think, and to teach those who would one day teach others. Staff Sergeant Liam Carter slowly lowered his phone, but the words he had just heard continued echoing in his mind. The confirmation from Quantico had removed every remaining doubt. Thomas Walker was not simply a retired Marine visiting an old base. Decades earlier, he had helped develop instructional methods that quietly influenced generations of Marine instructors. Around the training mat, complete silence settled over the gym. Corporal Mason Reed looked toward Thomas with an expression that no longer carried confidence or curiosity alone. It now reflected genuine respect mixed with disbelief. The quiet man standing only a few feet away had never once mentioned his own accomplishments. Thomas noticed the change in Mason's face and smiled gently. You look like you have another question, he said. Mason nodded without hesitation. Sir, why did you never tell us who you were? Thomas glanced around the room before answering. Because names are remembered for a while. Lessons are remembered much longer. No one spoke after that. The simplicity of the answer seemed more powerful than any long explanation could have been. Carter slipped the phone back into his pocket and stepped toward Thomas. Mr. Walker, he said respectfully, there are people on this base who should know you are here. Thomas offered a quiet smile. I only came to visit a place that meant something to me many years ago. Carter nodded. It still does. Without another word, he reached into his pocket once again and opened the command directory. This time he selected the office of Major General Daniel Harper, the commanding general responsible for the installation. Carter understood the significance of making such a call, but after hearing Quantico's confirmation, he believed it was entirely appropriate. The call connected through the general's executive aide. Carter introduced himself and calmly explained that Thomas Walker, a retired Marine instructor whose credentials had just been confirmed by Quantico, was standing inside the battalion training gym. The aide listened carefully before asking only one question. Is he still there? Yes, Carter answered. A brief pause followed before the aide replied. Please remain where you are. Major General Harper would like to come personally. Carter quietly thanked the aide and ended the call. Mason watched the exchange unfold without fully understanding what was about to happen. Thomas remained completely composed, showing no sign that anything unusual had occurred. Instead of discussing his own history, he turned his attention back toward Mason. May I offer one more observation? Mason immediately nodded. Please do. Thomas smiled warmly. You have excellent discipline. Never allow confidence to become louder than curiosity. The day you believe there is nothing left to learn is the day you stop becoming better. Mason absorbed every word. The sentence struck him more deeply than any formal lecture he had attended since joining the Marine Corps. Around them, several Marines unconsciously adjusted their footing and leaned closer, eager to hear every quiet lesson. The gym no longer resembled a training facility. It had become a classroom led by someone whose authority came entirely from experience rather than rank. A few minutes later, the heavy entrance doors opened softly. An executive aide stepped inside first, scanned the room, and respectfully moved aside. Behind him walked Major General Daniel Harper with calm, unhurried steps. The polished floor reflected his approach beneath the bright overhead lights. One by one, Marines turned toward the entrance until every eye followed the commanding general across the room. Harper did not speak immediately. His attention settled entirely on Thomas Walker, standing quietly beside the center mat. Recognition appeared almost instantly across the general's face. A warm smile replaced formal composure as he continued walking forward. The Marines watched in complete silence, sensing that another remarkable moment was about to unfold. Without anyone announcing it, the room understood that the quiet veteran standing before them had influenced far more of Marine Corps history than anyone had imagined when the morning first began, with nothing more than a friendly invitation to step onto the mat. Major General Daniel Harper continued walking across the polished floor with calm, deliberate steps while every Marine inside the gym instinctively straightened their posture. No command had been given, yet the atmosphere changed the moment the commanding general entered the room. Bright afternoon light streamed through the high windows, reflecting softly across the training mat, where Thomas Walker still stood with the same quiet composure he had shown since arriving that morning. Corporal Mason Reed watched the general approach, uncertain whether to remain where he was or step aside. Thomas simply remained relaxed, his hands resting naturally at his sides. As the distance between the two men disappeared, Major General Harper smiled with unmistakable warmth. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. Thomas accepted it with an easy smile of his own. "General Harper," Thomas said gently, "it has been many years." Harper nodded with genuine appreciation. "Not enough years for us to forget what you gave this Corps." The words settled across the room with remarkable weight. Every Marine present exchanged quiet glances, realizing they were witnessing something far beyond an ordinary reunion. Staff Sergeant Liam Carter stood respectfully to one side, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Harper looked toward the assembled Marines before speaking again. "Most of you know the techniques you practice every week," he said in a calm, steady voice. "Very few of you know where many of those teaching principles began." He turned toward Thomas. This man helped shape instructor development during a period when the Marine Corps was building better ways to prepare future instructors. His influence reached people who later trained thousands of Marines across the country. Silence filled the gym once again. Mason lowered his eyes briefly as every conversation from earlier that morning replayed inside his mind. The invitation meant for harmless entertainment now seemed almost impossible to believe. Thomas noticed the young corporal's expression and quietly stepped closer. "You have nothing to regret," he said softly. Mason looked up with surprise. "I underestimated you." Thomas smiled kindly. "You underestimated experience. That happens more often than you think. The important part is what you learn afterward." Mason nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Major General Harper folded his hands behind his back and continued speaking to the Marines. "History is not only preserved in museums or books. Sometimes it walks quietly into a room carrying an old canvas bag, expecting nothing except the chance to see another generation succeed." Several Marines smiled gently. The statement felt deeply personal because every person inside the gym knew exactly whom the general meant. Harper then turned back toward Thomas. "There is something I have wanted to say for many years." Thomas looked at him with quiet curiosity. "Many of the instructors who guided my generation were shaped by methods connected to your work. Whether they realized it or not, countless Marines benefited from lessons that began with people like you." Thomas lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Then they improved the lessons. That is exactly what they were supposed to do." Harper laughed softly. "You have not changed." "I hope not too much," Thomas replied with a gentle smile. Around the edge of the mat, every Marine remained completely silent. No phones appeared. No one whispered. The room had become a place of genuine reflection rather than curiosity. Mason finally stepped forward once more. "Sir," he said sincerely, "would you teach us one last lesson before you leave?" Thomas looked around the circle of young Marines standing before him. Their expressions no longer reflected amusement or uncertainty. They carried the quiet attention of students ready to listen. Thomas gave a slow nod. "Very well," he answered. "But this lesson has nothing to do with movement." The Marines instinctively leaned closer. Even Major General Harper remained silent. Everyone understood that the most important lesson of the day was about to begin, and it would not be found in a manual, a classroom, or a training schedule, but in the simple wisdom of a man who had spent a lifetime shaping others without ever asking to be remembered. Thomas Walker looked slowly around the quiet circle of Marines before speaking again. His calm blue eyes rested briefly on each young face, not as though he were judging them, but as though he genuinely hoped each one would carry something meaningful from the afternoon. The bright overhead lights reflected softly across the polished training floor, while warm sunlight streamed through the high windows, filling the gym with a peaceful glow that contrasted sharply with the nervous excitement that had filled the room only an hour earlier. "The lesson I want to leave with you," Thomas began gently, "has very little to do with standing on a training mat." Every Marine remained completely silent. Even the instructors listened without interruption. Major General Daniel Harper quietly stepped to one side, allowing Thomas to become the only voice inside the room. "You will all become skilled at something," Thomas continued. "Some of you will become instructors. Some will become leaders. Some will spend years helping Marines who have not even joined yet. Whatever path you take, never confuse recognition with purpose. Recognition belongs to other people. Purpose belongs to you." The words settled naturally across the room. Corporal Mason Reed stood motionless, absorbing every sentence with complete attention. Earlier that morning, he had believed confidence meant proving himself before others. Now he realized true confidence often needed no audience at all. Thomas smiled warmly at the young corporal. "You asked me why I never introduced myself." Mason nodded. Thomas continued, "Because if someone only listens after hearing your accomplishments, they are listening to your reputation instead of your character." Several Marines quietly lowered their eyes in thoughtful reflection. Staff Sergeant Liam Carter glanced around the gym and noticed expressions that had completely changed since Thomas first entered the building. There was no trace of amusement anywhere in the room. Only quiet respect remained. Major General Harper folded his hands behind his back and spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Mr. Walker has given every one of us a reminder that cannot be found inside official training publications." Thomas smiled modestly. "The manuals will continue improving long after I am gone. That is exactly how they should work." Harper nodded with genuine admiration. "Your humility may be your greatest lesson of all." Thomas gave a small shrug. Humility makes it easier. For several quiet moments, nobody moved. The Marine Corps gym remained completely still as warm afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished floor, blending with the bright overhead lights that had witnessed everything from laughter to quiet respect in a single remarkable day. Thomas Walker adjusted the strap of his worn canvas duffel bag across one shoulder and looked around the room one final time. The faces staring back at him had changed completely. Earlier they had seen an elderly visitor whose appearance invited harmless assumptions. Now they saw a man whose quiet influence had shaped generations they had never even met. Corporal Mason Reed stepped forward slowly until he stood only a few feet away. His posture remained straight, but the confidence that had first brought him onto the training mat had matured into genuine humility. He met Thomas's eyes and spoke with complete sincerity. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Thomas smiled gently and shook his head. "No," he answered. "You owe yourself the promise that you will never stop learning from people whose stories you have not heard yet." Mason nodded slowly. Those words carried more weight than any correction he had ever received during formal instruction. "I will remember that," he replied quietly. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on the young Marine's shoulder for only a brief moment before letting it fall naturally to his side. Then today was worthwhile. Staff Sergeant Liam Carter watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Throughout his career, he had witnessed demanding exercises, difficult evaluations, and memorable ceremonies. Yet none had transformed a room quite like the simple conversation unfolding before him. Major General Daniel Harper remained respectfully silent, understanding that no official speech could improve upon what every Marine had already experienced for themselves. Thomas reached the wooden bench where he had first placed his belongings. He gently straightened the folded field jacket over his arm, checked that the faded instructor identification card rested safely inside the inner pocket, and glanced once at the old leather watch fastened around his wrist. Every movement reflected the same careful discipline that had quietly impressed the room from the beginning. As he turned toward the open bay doors, something unexpected happened. Without a command from an instructor, without an order from the staff sergeant, and without a word from the major general, one Marine quietly came to attention. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, every Marine inside the gym stood tall in perfect silence, boots together, eyes forward, forming a respectful passage leading toward the exit. Thomas paused. He slowly looked from one side of the room to the other, taking in the young faces standing with complete sincerity. A gentle smile appeared across his weathered face. "Take care of one another," he said softly. "Teach with patience. Lead with humility. Someone once did that for you." No one answered because no answer was necessary. Thomas gave a small nod before continuing toward the sunlight waiting beyond the open doors. A light afternoon breeze moved the American flag outside, its quiet motion reflected in the polished glass of the entrance. Thomas stepped into the warm California daylight without looking back. He had never come seeking recognition, applause, or ceremony. He had only come to revisit a place that had once been part of his life. Behind him, the Marines remained standing until he disappeared from view. Mason finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought strength was something you demonstrated." Staff Sergeant Carter looked toward the empty doorway with a thoughtful smile. "Today you learned that the strongest people usually spend more time building others than proving themselves." Major General Harper nodded once before quietly leaving the gym, allowing the lesson to remain with those who needed it most. Training would continue tomorrow. New Marines would arrive. Fresh instructors would stand before new classes. Yet everyone present understood that one ordinary afternoon had become part of their own history. They would remember that real greatness rarely announces itself. True leadership speaks with humility instead of volume. And the finest legacy is carried forward not by those who seek recognition, but by those who quietly prepare others to become better than themselves. Some honors are written in records. The greatest ones live forever in the character of the people who choose to pass them on.